Good day. Today is Sunday, 29th December 2024. We're almost at the end of what has been an extremely volatile year. And I suspect that over the course of the next few weeks and months, the conditions in the world are going to become more volatile still, with a deepening crisis in Syria, with a military debacle for the West developing in Ukraine, and also with more pressure on energy prices, perhaps even an energy crisis developing as well. Now, I say all of that, and because we're back at that old problem which from memory goes all the way back to 2006. We are on the brink of another gas war between Russia and Ukraine, on top of the war that is being fought over Ukrainian territory, the actual war, the special military operation that is underway now. Now, there's been an article about this in Bloomberg. They're talking about how the contract for the transfer of Russian gas, the transit of Russian gas across Ukraine, a contract which has been honoured by both parties throughout the period of the special military operation, how that contract is about to collapse. They don't make clear that, as far as I can see, I can tell, it is the Ukrainians who are causing it to collapse. Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, other countries in Central and Eastern Europe are extremely worried about this. Undoubtedly, as Putin has confirmed, the issue of gas supplies from Russia was a topic that was brought up by Robert Fico during his visit to Moscow, so there's no question about this. Because the country that is at center stage in this crisis is Ukraine, and of course the European Union and Britain, Western Europe in other words, are going to be affected as well. This at a time when Germany is probably already in recession, when the British economy is reported to be going through a period of stagnation, where there is a budgetary crisis in Germany, Britain and France, where Italian bond yields are said to be rising, and there are growing concerns about the financial stability of Italy as well. In other words, all this is happening at a time when the European economy is already in very bad shape. It absolutely does not need another energy shock, but it is likely that that is what it is about to get. Now, some of us might say that if this does happen, it is simply a deferred reaction, effect to what was done back in February 2022, when the decision was made by the Europeans, by the British, as part of their sanctions war, their economic war against Russia, to stop importing Russian oil and Russian gas. They were confident that if they did that, that would create a fiscal crisis in Russia, that President Putin's war chest, as they always describe it, would quickly run out of money, that the internal financial stability of the Russian economy, already crippled by the freeze on Russia's central bank reserves, that would lead to a tremendous crisis in Russia, and it was expected that Russia, in a state of financial and economic collapse, would be left with no alternative than to capitulate to Western demands over Ukraine, causing undoubtedly President Putin's government to collapse, President Putin himself to lose office, and a new government, more Western aligned, to take power in Moscow. I've no doubt that that was the expectation. Well, of course, it has turned out otherwise. The Russians very rapidly adjusted to the sanctions. The Russians found that they had plenty of buyers for their oil and gas. In fact, in 2022, Russia ran a near record trade surplus. And of course, since then, the Russian economy has continued to grow. The latest GDP figures show GDP growth in the first 11 months of 4%. It's likely to end the year slightly lower, but perhaps not much. Who's to say? Anyway, Russia's economy continues to grow, and the European economies are all in the mess that I've just described. And of course, that mess is in part caused by that very decision to cut Europe off from oil and gas, Russian oil and gas, provided at steady, reliable, relatively low prices year upon year, a steady shift of oil and gas from the Russians to the Europeans, underpinning what was widely assumed to be a stable economic relationship. One which enabled the European economies to remain stable, at least the German economy to remain stable. One which had knock-on positive effects also on other European economies also, including those of Britain and France. And in fact, it was that very same steady supply of Russian oil and gas which not only made the European economy relatively stable and relatively balanced, but it also was what bought European political leaders the political space, which of course they misused, in my opinion, in a catastrophic way by pursuing unwise policies of excessive European centralization, and of course caused them to drift into a confrontation with Russia. They became so complacent, in other words, because of the stability that they saw around them, or the seeming stability that they saw around them, that they completely misjudged the underlying economic realities, the cause of that stability. And the result is the lower economic growth, the stagnation, the recession, the fiscal crises, the inflation pressures, all of these things which we are now seeing. Well, it looks as if this is all going to get much worse, because for the first 2 years after the decision to cut off Europe from Russian oil and gas imports, it's just possible to pretend that the problem had been avoided. There was increased imports of liquefied natural gas from the United States and from other places. Of course, that did cause energy costs to rise, but the Europeans were able to avoid blackouts across the economy, and they did so for two reasons, basically. Putting aside the LNG imports, the increased LNG imports. One was significant demand suppression, which is a euphemism for saying that a lot of factories in Germany especially either went into low rates of production or straightforwardly closed because they couldn't pay the higher energy costs. And that wasn't the case only in Germany, it was the case in other parts of Europe as well. So demand suppression was one reason why an energy crunch didn't happen. The other was relatively mild winters in 2022-2023 and 2023-2024. This year, that period when it was possible to pretend that the problem was not quite as bad as it might have looked initially, that period is perhaps ending, because it looks as if this year, this winter, is going to be significantly colder. There's been less wind, which means that wind power generation has been less. The amount of gas in Europe's energy storage is falling relatively rapidly, and the overall effect is that already we're starting to see a gradual uptick, in fact a steady uptick in European gas prices. Well, now it looks as if the situation is going to become still worse, because one of the other reasons, a little spoken about further reason, why there has been less pressure on prices in Europe than might have been expected, given the enormous step of cutting Europe off from gas and oil from its major energy supplier, which is to say Russia. One of the reasons that that happened is because the Europeans quietly continued to buy energy from Russia. They continued to import gas from Russia, LNG gas. They continued to import oil from Russia as well, using Indian middlemen. And they continued to import gas through pipelines. Pipelines from Turkey, crossing over from Turkey, those will still continue to operate, but also pipelines across Ukraine. The original Soviet-era pipelines built by the Soviet Union starting in the 1960s, going through all the way to the 1980s, the Druzhba pipeline complex, and all of that, that until this year remained in operation and was continuing to supply Europe with a certain amount of pipeline gas. Well, now, Ukraine's decision to stop the transit of gas across Ukraine by Russia's gas monopoly, Gazprom, that looks like it's about that looks like it means that transit of Russian gas across Ukraine is about to end. Now, Putin has made some very angry comments about this. He has discussed this. He discussed this in the same brief press conference which he gave after the Eurasian Economic Union summit meeting, in which he discussed, he set out his strong position, Russia's extremely strong position, his firm position, that there can be no question of Ukraine entering NATO at any point in the future, and that is for the Russians an immovable red line. It always has been, and it continues to be, and anybody who thinks that Ukraine can enter NATO at some point in the remote future, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, is fooling themselves. If they believe that, then the war between Ukraine and Russia will go on until Ukraine is finally and comprehensively defeated. And that was Putin's position. But in this really rather exasperated press conference, Putin also discussed the gas situation. And I'm going to read out what he said because it really is very interesting. And it sets out the whole problem. He said this, and this is specifically on the gas issue. As for energy supply agreements, we have always stood for such supplies, for depoliticizing economic matters. We have never refused to supply energy to Europe. I have said this 1,000 times, and I can repeat that it was Poland that stopped energy transits via its territory. He's referring here to the Yamal pipeline, a pipeline that supplied Russian gas to Central Europe, including Germany, by the way, and which transits across Poland. In 2022, in a decision that has been barely discussed anywhere in the West, the Poles simply closed that pipeline, preventing Russian gas transiting Poland to reach Germany. Anyway, this is what Putin then went on to say. You only need to press that route is operational. This is the one across Poland. Nobody has hit it. There were no explosions. He's referring to the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. So it can be used. You only need to press the button and gas will flow through it to Poland. It is the Yamal Europe pipeline which runs across Poland. You can turn it on any day and we will supply our gas. So the Yamal pipeline is still there, can be used. The Russians can still supply gas through the Yamal pipeline. The Poles have decided to switch it off. It's got nothing to do with Russia. And then Putin went on to say this. Another route runs across Ukraine. We supplied gas via it, even despite the war. We paid for the transit, and we continue to pay for it. What is happening there? There are two routes across Ukraine via Sudzha. Sudzha is, of course, the town that Ukraine controls in Kursk region. And Sokhranovka. Our forces have taken over Sokhranovka. This is in Ukraine. And the route has been operating normally for 6 months, if not longer. Ukrainian specialists worked at the checkpoint and nobody harassed them or messed with them. They operated the system in accordance with the established procedure and everything was fine. But Kiev decided suddenly that it should be shut down, and they have done so under the pretext that it was controlled by Russian troops. Why did they not do so 6 months ago? It has been operating normally, which means that they have some other reasons. I do not understand what it could be. So the Russians captured this place, Sokhranovka, 6 months ago. But there were no problems. The gas continued to be supplied through Sokhranovka, transiting Ukraine. But the Ukrainians have now decided the transit through Sokhranovka must end, despite the fact that it continued to take place, despite this Sokhranovka 6 months ago coming under Russian control. And then Putin went on to say this. Or take Sudzha. Sudzha, of course, is in Kursk region, where fighting is ongoing. It is essentially controlled by Ukraine, yet we continue to supply 14 million cubic meters a day. Even though the Ukrainians control Sudzha now, they have announced that they will not renew the transit contract. It was not us who said the operation will be stopped. They announced that they would not renew the transit contract. They do not want it, so let it be so. They're eating from Europe's hand because Ukraine cannot continue to fight, let alone exist, without Europe's support. But they have decided to punish Europe by terminating the contract on transit of our gas to Europe, where in Europe the situation is becoming difficult with gas prices running at about $500 per 1,000 cubic meters. At this point in time, I can tell you that there is no transit contract, and it is impossible to sign a new one within the next 3 or 4 days. In other words, by the new year, when the contract ends. Meanwhile, prices will continue to grow. We have not provoked this. It is not our policy. What is the problem? They have said that there will be no contract, that they would not extend it. They being, of course, the Ukrainians. And then they realized that this has created a problem for them. And they panicked. What does this mean? They have appealed to everyone that they cannot replace Naftogaz Ukraine as a party to the contract, a transit contract with us. So the gas will run to the border under Gazprom's control and across Ukraine under someone else's control. So what the Ukrainians in effect have suddenly realized is that by terminating the contract, the transit contract with Russia, the gas transit contract with Russia, they're going to end up with no gas themselves, because the gas moves across Ukraine, the Russians supply it, it goes through the pipelines across Ukraine, and of course it is heading to Europe. But some of this gas, quite a lot of it in fact, remains in Ukraine. And it remains in Ukraine and is the gas that Ukraine uses in its energy system as a result of a extraordinary, bizarre mechanism which is called reverse flow. Now, what that sounds like is that Russia sends the gas to Europe, the Europeans buy the gas, and then they send some of the gas back up the pipelines to Ukraine. That's the theory. That's the way it's always presented. Of course, it is actually technically impossible. You cannot send gas up a pipe, a gas pipe, at the same time as you are sending gas simultaneously down the same pipeline, down the same pipe. I mean, I think that is obvious. Besides, I understand that given the way the systems are built, it's not actually easy to send gas up a pipe when the pipe is actually designed to send the gas down the same pipe. Presumably the pipe could be reconfigured in some way. You could do all kinds of work to turn the system round. It would require a certain amount of investment, probably an awful lot of investment. Maybe it's been done, though I think that might be a big assumption actually. But overall, it's not very easy to do. You can't just send gas down up a pipe when the pipe is built to send the gas down the pipe. But anyway, let's move on. So what reverse flow really has amounted to is this. The Europeans buy from the Russians more gas than they actually need in terms of the gas that flows across Ukraine. And the Ukrainians then take some of this gas which the Europeans have paid for, and it remains in Ukraine. The rest of the gas continues to move towards Europe. In other words, what we're talking about is that the Europeans are basically paying the price of the gas that Ukraine is buying from Russia. That's basically what reverse flow means. But in order for that to happen, there has to be gas flowing down the pipelines. In the first place, the Russians must be sending gas down the pipelines in the first place for that gas to be there for the Ukrainians to use. If there are no transit contracts, then there is no gas going down the pipeline, and the Ukrainians can't retain a part of it paid for by the European Union for their own use. So they now find that by cancelling the contract, the transit contract, they are in effect cutting themselves off from Russian gas, which could, in fact would, lead to a significant gas shortage in Ukraine. Maybe gas shortage is a euphemism, a gas crisis in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians, having said that they are not going to renew the transit agreement with the Russians, suddenly understood that that meant that they're going to be without gas, and they panicked, and they've come up with a proposal, an alternative idea. They're not going to renew the transit agreement with the Russians, but they will introduce a middleman who will buy the gas from the Russians when it reaches the border, the Russian-Ukrainian border, and who will then sell that gas to the Europeans and then ultimately to the Ukrainians. And Putin describes how the plan will work. They want the relevant structures in Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey or Azerbaijan to sign a contract for gas transit via Ukraine, and Gazprom would have to deal with its partners once this gas reaches Ukraine's border with Europe. So the idea is that you create a middleman, the Russians sell the gas, enter into a transit agreement, they sell the gas in effect to this particular consortium, that this middleman consortium. When it reaches the Ukrainian border, the gas is then transported across Ukraine through this Ukraine's pipeline network by this middleman. It then reaches the Ukrainian border with Europe. Gazprom still has gas supply contracts with several European customers. And then, of course, it would have to buy the gas from this middleman in order to go on and sell the gas to some of its European customers. So, by inserting a middleman into this process, you can already see that you're going to significantly increase the cost, because there are going to be two contracts where there was one, and a new party is going to be introduced into the mechanism, who will, of course, demand its own cut, just to say. So that cost, that additional cost, inevitably is going to be passed on to European consumers. So if this Ukrainian scheme is ever put into effect, well then that is going to increase gas prices in Europe anyway. But it looks as if this scheme is not going to be put into effect, and Putin then explains why. The problem is that Gazprom has long-term contracts, some until 2035, others until 2049. And these contracts will have to be renegotiated in order to adapt to this new transit environment. This is an extremely complex procedure, hard to solve, insoluble even. This is the first point. Something that can't be done in 4 days, in other words. And then Putin goes on to get to the rub of this. As to the second point, I'm explaining this in such detail to keep everyone informed and avoid subsequent speculations. Ukraine has shut down one of the transit routes for Russian gas exports to Europe, the pipeline that runs via Sokhranovka. They just closed it, and that was it. We have been operating under a ship or pay contract. They closed it and then sued us, demanding payment for gas that did not transit through Ukraine. So what Putin is saying is that even if this new mechanism is created, the only gas that would pass through Ukraine would be gas that would pass through Suja. The Ukrainians have cut off the other pipeline through Sokhranovka, but they're saying that even though they closed the pipeline, the Russians are not supplying the gas that was supposed to be sent to Ukraine via Sokhranovka, and the Ukrainians are therefore going to sue the Russians for the gas that is not being supplied to Ukraine via Sokhranovka. And if that sounds illogical, well then this is what Putin has to say about that. When Gazprom asked, "Are you crazy or what? You closed that transit." In other words, it was the Ukrainians who stopped the supply. The Ukrainians said, "Well, we did, but you have to pay anyway." Sheer nonsense. That's Putin's phrase. Now they said they would allow a third party to operate gas transits via their territory. At the same time, they refused to withdraw their claim from the Court of Arbitration, which, by the way, is located in Stockholm and has a history of making decisions in gas disputes between Russia and Ukraine, which have been seen by the Russians as inherently and extremely biased in favour of Ukraine. So they refused to withdraw their claim from the Court of Arbitration. If the court rules in Ukraine's favour, then you and I, many hundreds, 150 million Russian citizens, will be supplying gas to any European country without getting money for that, because the money will go to Ukraine to pay off its claim against Gazprom. Under the court's decision, this money will be debited directly, as they call it. This is absurd. We cannot do it. So what Putin is saying is this: what will happen if the Ukrainians continue with their lawsuit, as they say, is that the Ukrainians will continue this case. They will win, because the Court of Arbitration always decides in their favour, regardless of the absurdity of whatever claim Ukraine is bringing. There have been examples of that before. Ukraine will be awarded some improbably vast amount. The Russians will be supplying their gas through Suja. It will be transiting the pipeline. There will be all these complicated mechanisms that I've discussed in order for the gas to arrive in Europe. But instead of payment being made for the gas to Gazprom, it will be made to Ukraine instead, because the Europeans, acting in accordance with the Stockholm Court's judgment, will simply transfer the money to Ukraine instead of Russia. So Ukraine will get gas, and it will also get money. The Russians will be supplying the gas, and they will get nothing. And then Putin went on to say, "We said we were ready to supply gas, even if it would be through Azerbaijan's Sokar, or a Turkish company, or a Hungarian or Slovak company. But they need to withdraw the lawsuit." They still said no. "Well, you have now made your bed, now lie in it. Live without our gas. It's time to bring it to a close, let's take a question from the red tie over there, very pre-New Year style. And he's referring to the next journalist. And by this point, by the way, he was becoming, as anybody who follows the press conference, increasingly angry. And eventually he stormed out in a very sudden and abrupt way. So there it is. The Russians are saying, Putin is saying, enough's enough. We're not going to go on playing these games. The Ukrainians are absolutely not going to get gas that Russia is not being paid for. If the Europeans and the Ukrainians continue to play these games, well, live without Russian gas. That's it. The Russians have just had enough. In his words, it is time to bring it to a close. I have discussed the issue of Russian gas supply to Europe many, many times and in many, many places. Certainly from the Russians' point of view, it was a very lucrative business. The Europeans have paid more for Russian gas than other buyers, like China, for example, have done. And this made Europeans complacent that this trade would go on indefinitely, that the Russians would have no incentive in looking for other buyers. I remember when, about a decade ago, the first reports about the Russian gas pipeline to China, the Power of Siberia pipeline, circulated. Lots of people in Europe were saying it would never be built because it made no economic sense. The Russians would have no reason to sell their gas to China at a lower price than the one they were receiving for selling their gas to Europe. And the point I always made in every single discussion I had many discussions about this with all sorts of people who brought this very topic up with me, was that trust, good faith, is an absolutely essential element in any business relationship. A supplier needs to be confident if they enter into a long-term contract with a customer, that a customer will not only pay the price, but will maintain the relationship in a balanced and mutually beneficial way. And this has not happened. We've seen endless attempts by the Europeans to overturn and revise Gazprom's contracts. There have been ceaseless demands for the Russians to accept the so-called third energy package, which means breaking up Gazprom's gas export monopoly, something which the Russians consider to be a fundamental national interest. We've seen publicity campaigns against Gazprom, court decisions against Gazprom, European Commission investigations against Gazprom, media campaigns against Gazprom. We've seen European states side with Ukraine when Ukraine stole Russian gas intended for other customers by siphoning gas from pipelines and retaining it for itself without paying for it. We see this happen time and time again. The Russians became more and more exasperated. Back in 2015, Angela Merkel came to Moscow, persuaded the Russians, very much against their better judgment, to revive an earlier proposal made by Gerhard Schröder and to build another direct pipeline from Russia to Germany, Nord Stream 2, in order to supply gas to Germany with bypassing Ukraine. Then that pipeline was blown up. The original Nord Stream pipeline, also, by the way, essentially a creature of the Helmut Kohl, Gerhard Schröder era of energy cooperation between Germany and Russia. The Nord Stream pipelines were mostly blown up. The Russians have been excluded from every part of the investigation. Putin is saying enough is enough. We've now reached the end of the road. There's no conceivable way that we're going to carry on with this. If the Ukrainians think that we are going to be played for fools, they're obviously mistaken. At this point, from this moment, gas supply to Europe by Russia across Ukraine ends. It's the end. It's time to bring it to a close. You've made your bed, now lie in it, live without our gas. Now, I think, again, that Putin needs to be taken at his word. I see no sign, as of this morning, that the Russians are going to change their stance. That means that on the 1st of January, there will be no supplies of Russian gas transiting across Ukraine, heading for Europe. Now, that will not mean the complete ending of gas supply by Russia to Europe. Gas is still being supplied to Europe via the Turk Stream pipeline. There's been apparently attempts by all sorts of people, probably Ukrainian, to try to damage that particular pipeline. There were even some leaks of some apparent documents or discussions within Ukraine about how Erdogan would, how when it was discovered that there were some people in Ukraine doing that, there were concerns expressed by some people in Ukraine that Erdogan would never forgive any attack on Turk Stream. I believe that, by the way. So Turk Stream continues to operate. Gas, Russian gas, pipeline gas, still flows to Europe via the Istanbul gas hub. That is the gas which I suspect will continue to flow to Slovakia and Hungary. That is probably what Fico agreed with Putin. Whilst he was in Moscow, there will be corresponding agreements reached between Turkey and Russia, Slovakia and Hungary, and presumably Turkey to that effect. But it will not flow through Ukraine. And of course, the ending of Russian gas supply to Europe across Ukraine reduces the flow of gas to Europe. There is LNG still coming from the United States and from Russia, but of course the Biden administration, backed by some people in Europe, now wants to stop, to sanction continued supplies of Russian LNG gas to Europe. Now, all of this, bad enough, but of course, the Biden administration is also, according to some reports, in fact, I've no doubt about this, in fact, is about to announce further sanctions on Russian oil supplies. It's likely that Russian oil is still going to flow to all kinds of other customers, to India and China. There'll be problems in that flow, but more likely than not, the Europeans are going to have to observe these American sanctions. So the Europeans look like they're about to lose the gas, a significant amount of gas from Russia flowing to Europe across Ukraine, and they're also going to face sanctions imposed by the Biden administration upon Russian oil also flowing to Europe, some of it through middlemen. So the crisis is going to get worse. Europe's energy price crisis is going to get worse. And of course, we now have Donald Trump becoming president of the United States. He's always been keen to promote energy exports, American energy exports, but there are reports that the shale revolution in the United States is now reached its ceiling, that oil and gas production in the United States is now going to start to tail off and might soon begin to reduce. Donald Trump, quite plausibly, is therefore going to want to keep as much gas and oil in the United States as he can. There have previously been legal restrictions imposed by the US government on exports of oil and gas by American companies. Donald Trump, America firster as he is quite capable of reimposing them. And then where will the Europeans get their gas? Well, there's Qatar, but Qatar, huge producer that it is, cannot replace Russia. So anyway, that is where we are heading. And Ukraine also, of course, is going to be in severe difficulties because it will no doubt continue to want to import gas, or at least receive gas from the European Union. It won't be able to get gas through this mechanism of reverse flow that I described earlier, but it probably will seek some imports of gas from the European Union. Maybe, as I said, the pipelines can be adjusted to allow gas to flow back into Ukraine, going up the pipeline now that there is no gas from Russia going down the pipeline. So quite plausibly, quite reasonably, it could be the case that some of this gas might return to Ukraine in that way. But bear in mind that Europe is going to be very short of gas before very long. There's already signs that the reserves, as I said, are falling fast. The price of gas is going to rise, and there's not going to be gas received across the pipelines from Russia. So, supplying gas to Ukraine when Europe itself is experiencing reductions in gas supply and when gas prices are high is going to be a severe economic burden and probably politically controversial as well. And of course, going beyond this, there's now a suggestion by Bloomberg that if Russian gas can no longer transit the Ukrainian pipelines, as it has always been doing, that might open up the pipelines, make the pipelines a potential target for Russian air and missile strikes, which have not up to now happened, because, of course, the Russians have themselves been using the pipelines to supply their own gas to Europe. Now, I am not myself certain that this will happen, I should say, because if the Russians do attack the pipelines, that's going to upset some of their remaining friends in Europe, Hungary and Slovakia, which perhaps will hope that one day those pipelines might be reopened once there is a political settlement in Ukraine. The Hungarians and the Slovaks might not be happy if the Russian Air Force starts to destroy the pipelines. And of course, the Russians, who are perhaps looking now towards a possible end of the war and maybe to the establishment of a new friendly government, friendly to themselves, in Kiev, they too might say that it is not in their interests to attack the gas pipeline network. But whereas until now, Russian attacks on the gas pipeline network made no sense, maybe now they do. I don't know what the Russians are going to decide. Certainly, if they start to see gas from Europe start being sent up those pipelines, they might decide that it makes no sense for them to hold back, and they could attack the pipelines. Who's to say? I'm not saying one way or the other. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see. So this is turning now into a very significant potential crisis. Now, Ukraine is already facing a major crisis in terms of electricity supply. Ukraine's thermal power stations have been largely destroyed. As we'll say in a moment, there have been attacks by the Russians it looks as if the Russians are about to capture the Kurakhovo thermal power plant, another power plant about to be captured. But the thermal power stations are not operating. The nuclear power stations in Ukraine have not so far been attacked, but the electricity substations have been, and that has affected the distribution of electricity supplied by those nuclear power stations. So Ukraine is short of electricity. It is importing electricity from the European Union. The major exporters within the European Union of electricity to Ukraine are Slovakia and Hungary. Fico is already threatening to cut off supply of electricity to Ukraine if Ukraine doesn't renew the transit agreement with Russia. Zelensky is furious about this. He's accusing Fico of opening an energy front, a second energy front against Ukraine, which I have to say, given the way Ukraine has been acting, the way Zelensky himself has been acting, looks to me like yet another example of this staggeringly vast sense of entitlement that the Ukrainians have and have had throughout this conflict. But anyway, electricity supply is already short, very critically short in Ukraine. If the Slovaks cut off electricity supply to Ukraine, if the Hungarians follow, then it will get worse. The situation will get worse still. Gas has been and continues to be available in Ukraine, but after the 1st of January, that cannot be guaranteed. And of course, the entire heating systems across Ukraine function on gas. Not just heating systems, cooking systems, all of these things. Of course, the shortages of electricity affect those as well. But we could be looking at a cumulative disaster. And of course, if the Russians start attacking the pipeline network, as Bloomberg says, then this situation could become completely critical over the next few weeks and months. Well, that's Ukraine, and I don't want to understate the humanitarian effects of all of this upon the Ukrainian people who've had to endure so much over the last 3 years and indeed before. But for Europe, this is all ultimately very bad news. And you would have thought that it would be the main topic of discussion. It would be discussed, for example, as one of the main topics in the German election, which is now due to happen in February. No sign of this. None. There continues to be an atmosphere of omerta right across Europe on this whole gas supply issue. Well, there we are. We will see where all this goes. As Putin has said, you made your bed, now lie in it, live without our gas. It's time to bring it to a close. We'll see where we are in the new year, how things play out. But for those of us who live in Europe and in energy terms, Britain remains very much part of Europe. The British pretended before 2022 that they didn't import gas from Russia when the restrictions on Russian gas imports were imposed. It became very clear very quickly that we were affected in Britain to a similar extent as other Europeans were. Well, to the extent that the Europeans still rely on Russian gas and are short of gas, well, it could very well be that household bills and industry bills for gas are going to spike again, and that there will be another twist in the European inflation spiral, and that more companies will close, the stagnation in Europe will deepen, things will continue to get worse. Well, there it is. We will see where we go and how this plays out, but this is a big story and it is not getting the attention that it deserves. Now, let's talk about other things. And I'm going to say again that it looks to me as if we're not only seeing now the starting clear signs that the defense lines in Ukraine are starting to crumble, but further evidence of acceleration that this is indeed the case. Now, this morning, there are reports that the Russians have cleared or are clearing the Kurakhovo thermal power plant west of Kurakhovo. The last place, the last refuge of the Ukrainian troops who were still holding out in Kurakhovo. And I assume, if this is correct, that the Ukrainian soldiers, I don't know how many there are, probably a couple of hundred, the remaining Ukrainian soldiers are now attempting to flee the 6 kilometers across the freezing fields, as I said, under constant fire and surveillance by the Russians. I've already discussed the grisly nature of that escape, if that is indeed what is happening. We've also had a really plaintive plea from the Ukrainian troops defending Velika Novosilka for them to be given orders to retreat. The Russians have closed all the main roads to Velikaya Novosilka. Our old friend Vladimir Rogov is saying that there is only a dirt track left that they can use to escape. The Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka are saying that unless they are given the order to retreat today, which is 29th December, further opportunities to withdraw will be in effect denied them. They will be trapped in Velikaya Novosilka, which will certainly fall and fall quickly. And they also imply that this would be a terrible outcome for them. Now, whenever there's been pleas like this sent by Ukrainian military units in the past, I remember this happening in Avdiivka, for example, in the Azovstal factory in Mariupol. Whenever there have been these sort of pleas, the authorities in Kiev, Zelensky and Syrskyi, have spurned them. Maybe they will again. Who knows? But anyway, for the moment, we're getting these pleas from these soldiers in Velikaya Novosilka. They say that today is their last day, the last day that they have, where they have a genuine hope of escape. My own guess is that the Battle of Velikaya Novosilka is now definitely coming to an end. I suspect that there will be only a desultory resistance in Velikaya Novosilka when the Russians finally do attack this small town, this attempt to storm this small town. I suspect that some Ukrainian soldiers, very wisely, will decide to surrender rather than fight to the last man. What would be the point? But unfortunately, some of them probably will try to escape. They won't be able to use the dirt road because the Russians are coming very close to it, apparently, according to the maps. And quite plausibly, they will have their drones operating above it. So the Ukrainian soldiers will again be forced to flee across the freezing fields, again hunted by the Russian drones and the troops. And most of them again will come to a terrible end that I don't really want to talk about. So those two battles, Kurakhovo and Velikaya Novosilka, are now, I suspect, at their final hours. Further north, in the area of Pakrovsk, the Russians have just said that they have advanced further in the area of Shevchenko. I believe this report has come from Marochko, by the way. And another one of our friends from the Russian side. And that the Ukrainians have been pulling back their troops. And there is a film discussed by Dima at the Military Summary channel yesterday of a senior Ukrainian officer arriving at a checkpoint in Pakrovsk, or between Mirnograd and Pakrovsk, and finding it deserted. That the Ukrainian soldiers there, whoever they were, apparently have melted away. Now, I think that one should be careful before making any rapid judgments about this. It's likely that there are desertions from the Ukrainian troops in the Pakrovsk-Mirnograd area. It's also likely that others are still fighting or still prepared to fight. I don't think the Russians are just going to roll over Pakrovsk. But anyway, however typical or untypical this event at this checkpoint was, it doesn't look as if the situation in Pakrovsk for the Ukrainians is at all good. And it also looks as if the Russian advances to the west of Pakrovsk continue in exactly the same way that I discussed yesterday, encountering no effective resistance. There are no Ukrainian reserves apparently left to hold back the Russians in this area. So the Russian advances continue in southwestern Donbass. I understand that in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and in Sudzha, in the Sudzha area and Kursk region, it is much the same story. A couple of weeks ago, there were lots of reports about Ukraine mounting some kind of offensive. There were rumors that the Ukrainians were going to make another attempt to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. There was an attack by the Ukrainian forces on the east bank of the Dnieper, further north in Zaporozhye region. That sputtered out fairly quickly, and the Russians were able to push the Ukrainians back. And for the moment, there's been no sign of a Ukrainian attack towards the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, as some had expected. There was also rumors that the Ukrainians were about to launch another operation in Bryansk region in Russia, north of Kursk region. So far, that too has not materialized. And with every week that passes, it seems less and less likely that it will. And in the Kupiansk area, and this long, complex battle on the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, it's starting to look increasingly as if, after a long, grinding battles, the situation is now turning decisively against the Ukrainians. Apparently there's now film which shows that the Russians are in firm control of Terny, a village on the Zherebets river, that the Russians have significantly enlarged their bridgehead on the Oskol river north of Kupiansk, that they've established another bridgehead west of the Zherebets river, that they're in fact close to mounting another attack on the town of Liman, close to Slavyansk. So everything looks on the front lines as if the Ukrainian resistance is crumbling, that the Ukrainians are basically running short, are so short of troops, so short of infantry now, and indeed of weapons, that they're finding it increasingly difficult to keep the fight going. Now, I have received reports from a source that the Russians have, that the Americans have successfully collected a significant amount of hardware that formerly belonged to the Syrian army. Some of it has been sent to Europe, parts of it to the Czech Republic, and I suspect that this equipment is being inspected, and there's some consideration, no doubt, about sending it to Ukraine. I wonder in what kind of a condition this equipment is in, given what we saw about the state of the Syrian army. And this same source thought that it might take about 6 months for this equipment to arrive in Ukraine, by which point I suspect it will be far too late. And I doubt anyway that this equipment is sufficient in quantity to change the situation on the battlefronts to any significant degree. Just saying. So anyway, there it is. We are looking at a dreadful military situation. Now, here I would say that I have read over the last couple of hours 2 very interesting articles about the Ukrainian situation. Now, one is in the National Interest, one of these magazines, one of the 3 big magazines discussing foreign policy, published in the United States. Foreign Policy is one, Foreign Affairs is the other, and the National Interest is the third. This article is written by Ramzi Mardini, who is a colleague of Professor Mearsheimer at Chicago University, just saying. And, well, again, as one might expect, it's actually a fine article, and it discusses the whole question of escalation risks. It's a very interesting article about escalation management, just saying. Anyway, this article discusses at length this perennial Western habit of escalating in Ukraine on the assumption that the Russians will never escalate back. And the point made by Professor Mardini is that this is not only extremely reckless and unwise, it fails to understand escalation management and escalation risk. Because whilst the Russians undoubtedly do have a strategy, which is to try to avoid expanding the war as much as they can, given that they're winning the war and that from their point of view, they have no interest in expanding the war in that way, given that this might could potentially jeopardize the prospects for their victory. And of course, if escalation gets completely out of control, theirs and everyone else's existence. Nonetheless, this Western pattern of escalation, what it is going to do, and what it has already to a great extent done, as shown by the original Russian decision to begin the special military operation, what it is doing is leading the Russians to conclude that the West is implacably hostile to themselves, and that is in effect governing Russian responses and is resulting in the Russians taking steps like, for example, the decision to start the special military operation, which in another context could be seen as escalatory. In other words, escalation can provoke responses which don't happen instantly, but which are nonetheless a consequence of the original escalation. And this is something that those who continuously test Russian red lines seem unable to think about or understand. I found it a most interesting and insightful piece. It was one of those articles which explained things clearly, things which I suppose many of us have sort of sensed but never really worked out. Anyway, this article works it out, and it works it out very clearly and very thoroughly and very well. So I would strongly recommend it. Its title is "The Perils of Escalation with Russia Are Still Very Real." It is by Ramzi Mardini. It was published on the 27th of December 2024, and it is in the national interest. Now, the other article which I find most interesting is an article which was translated by Jeff Roberts, and it's not, I think, therefore available for most people to read, but it is by the well-known Russian commentator Dmitry Trenin. Now, Trenin is very much one of those Russian journalists who has in the past been keen on a good relationship between Russia and the United States, and indeed the West. He's been, I think he's actually lived and worked in the United States for quite a long time. So he is not in any sense a hardliner. I mean, or at least he wasn't until a few years ago thought to be one. He's now found himself very much, I believe he's even been sanctioned. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he hasn't been sanctioned. But anyway, he's made himself a deeply unpopular figure amongst the neocon crowd in Washington. As far as I know, he's back in Moscow. And he has penned a very interesting piece about the final outcome of the war in Ukraine. He takes it as read that the Russians are going to achieve a military victory, and he proposes, or he sets out, a possible route whereby the Russians could also win the peace. Now, what I found most interesting about this article is that Trenin, who, as I said, is in no sense a hardliner, was assuming that it is the Russians and the Russians alone who are going to decide everything. He is not even considering possible negotiations between Russia and the United States. Certainly he's not looking at ceasefires, Korean War armistice scenarios, freezes, European troop deployments. He's not looking at any of this. He doesn't, I think, even mention Trump by name anywhere in this article. He's just looking at the war in Ukraine, looking at the fact that the Russians are going to win, saying, from a Russian point of view, given that we're going to win, given that the West is going to remain implacably hostile, what should we do? And he says, well, basically there are three options. Option one is to go on marching all the way to the Polish border, occupy the whole of Ukraine. And he said there are major problems with this because there are many people in Western Ukraine who frankly don't like us, who we cannot easily integrate into our society. We could get ourselves into all sorts of difficulties if we go there. We should stick to trying to integrate those places, those regions in Ukraine, if we reach them, where we would have a real prospect of success in integrating them into our society. And by the way, he names places like Kiev, Odessa, Nikolaev, places like that. So he says, perhaps better not go all the way to Western Ukraine, to the Polish border. On the other hand, he also says that it might be a mistake to allow a Ukrainian state to continue to function, even though the Ukrainians have a certain, right to a state. They have wanted one. It's perhaps legitimate that they should have one. But Russia, it might be unwise for the Russians simply to allow a Ukrainian state to function, even one that has lost the four regions, given that the West will continue to be implacably hostile and will seek, probably, to pull this Ukrainian state back into its orbit and to make it a threat to Russia all over again. So, given this, Trenin proposes, and by the way, he acknowledges that this is not going to be an easy process, though he seems very confident that the Russians have the history and the experience to win the peace in these sort of conflicts. He points out, for example, how successful the Russians have been in Chechnya, and now in making up with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Anyway, what he proposes is that the Russians should take control of the territory that will integrate with themselves. That might be more than the four regions. And then what is left should be divided into two states. A central Ukraine, presumably with its capital in Kiev, over which the Russians retain a certain degree of control, and which they would have good reasons and expectations would in time become friendly to themselves. A Ukraine in which the Orthodox Church is restored, and that would be a good bridge, bringing this Ukraine back into harmony with Russia. And as for Western Ukraine, the territories acquired by Stalin at the end of the Second World War, just leave that to the West. Leave that to the West for the Western powers to take over and do what they want with. That could be that could be a possible outcome. How it plays out, how it is achievable, I'm not really sure. But anyway, maybe that is what we will see. And maybe what Trenin is suggesting could turn out in the end to reflect Russian strategy. Now, Trenin's words have some interest because one can see how some people in the West, in Europe specifically, are becoming increasingly worried about how this could play out, what Russian strategic objectives in Ukraine might be. There's an article in the Financial Times, a long one, which is primarily about American foreign policy under Donald Trump. It discusses what the effect of MAGA, America First, would be on the global situation. But he has this to say about the Ukrainian conflict. Western officials note that Putin's pre-war demands extended well beyond Ukraine. In an ultimatum that the Kremlin issued in December 2021, Russian demands included the withdrawal of all NATO forces from Eastern Europe, from East European countries that joined the alliance after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. The assumption inside NATO, notice that they say this as if they know for a fact what people within NATO are thinking. They mean now the NATO Secretariat, and I'm fairly sure that this is true. The assumption inside NATO is that the war in Ukraine and the immense losses inflicted on Russian forces by Western-backed Ukrainian forces, well, we can disregard that, will have made Putin even more radical in his thinking. One senior European official said, "We need to understand that Russia thinks it is already at war with us." Absolutely, they do think that, and why wouldn't they? Just saying. An American counterpart adds that a Russian victory in Ukraine would present a huge threat to NATO. Well, so it will. Long-term future of NATO would indeed be in jeopardy. But who has brought that about? But anyway, then we go on to read that what they fear in Washington and Brussels, it is now assumed that Russia is determined not just to hang on to the Ukrainian territory it has occupied, but also in effect to end the country's independence by getting a veto over Ukraine's foreign and security policies, as well as setting up a Moscow-friendly government in Kiev. Now, that is not so far from what Trenin is suggesting. Now, I don't myself think, I wouldn't describe Trenin's suggestions quite as radically as the Financial Times is saying. I think the Russians are more accommodating about Ukraine than this implies. They certainly don't want to, they wouldn't, if Trenin's ideas were implemented, they wouldn't be governing Ukraine directly. But certainly, they made it fairly clear that they do want fundamental changes within Ukraine, reflecting what Trenin is saying, that will change Ukraine's long-term orientation. And what Trenin is saying is, let's do it, but let's do it without Western Ukraine. Maybe that is where we're going. Maybe that is the direction of travel. Some people in Brussels, clearly, are very alarmed about this possibility. But then, why would the United States be? And the Financial Times talks about this too. Trump's transactional nature, his determination to avoid war, and his contempt for democratic allies, well, the Financial Times would throw that in, might lead the United States to strike a new grand bargain with Russia and China. The US tacitly grants Russia and China spheres of influence in their respective regions, America concentrates on asserting dominance on its own in its own region. Mexico, Canada, Greenland, of course, seeking to take back the Panama Canal and gain control of Greenland. Trump forces a peace deal on Ukraine without accompanying security guarantees. Sanctions against Russia are relaxed, and Putin is welcomed to a Thanksgiving dinner at Mar-a-Lago. I don't think this is impossible. We can see what the Europeans are afraid of. But then, who has brought this about? The Russians may be starting to think in these terms. I don't think it is impossible, based on Trenin's article. I don't think it is impossible that under Trump, the Americans might come round eventually to the same point of view. Anyway, tomorrow I'm going to turn to other topics, including the seeming failure of the colour revolution attempt in Georgia. Former President Salome Zurabishvili failed to live up to her promise of barricading herself in the presidential palace in Georgia. She left. There is now a new president aligned with Georgia Dream in the presidential palace. His constitutional term begins now. Zurabishvili continues to insist that she's the legitimate president of Georgia, though it's difficult to see upon what basis. So it looks to me as if the colour revolution attempt has failed. There have been some very interesting articles, including one by David Stockman, about the situation in Syria. I'm going to turn to those, I hope, in my next programme. But this is where today's programme ends. It seems to me Europe heading towards another gas crisis and perhaps staring at the possibility of a grand bargain between the United States and Russia that might indeed leave it out in the cold. Whose fault, to repeat, ultimately would that be? But anyway, that's where we are. I'll be back tomorrow. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.